Hey there, healthcare humans. I am Samantha Wilding. Welcome back to the Healing Healthcare Burnout podcast. And today we are talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. It's something I have been quote unquote corrected on over and over throughout the course of my life. It's something that I've never fully come to understand until recently, and that is fidgeting. So, for those of you who aren't aware, and I've talked about this a little bit before on the podcast, I have a history of ADHD, and ADHD and fidgeting go together like soup and sausage, like like rice and even more rice. They are intimately connected, and there's some interesting reasons behind how they're connected. But the other thing that connects fidgeting and potentially our work environment is our stress response. So whether you have ADHD or whether you don't, there may be some curious advantages to fidgeting as you work. So one thing that's going to be a caveat is that nothing I will ever tell you is a monolith. So for some people, you're going to find some significant benefit in allowing yourself to fidget, in not stopping yourself from fidgeting. For some people, you may find that it poses a bigger challenge. So the first thing to keep in mind about fidgeting is that fidgeting can actually be an indicator of your internal stress level. So are you in such a place that you are calm inside? Are you able to be truly relaxed? Are you able to be just super chilled? Or are you in such a place where your body is experiencing some tension, you're experiencing some anxiety, you're experiencing some stress, and it's coming out in the form of this physical activity? And what's really interesting is I spend a lot of time teaching people stress recovery techniques. And in fact, we're going to talk about a very cool thing I have coming up towards the end of the podcast. But one of the things that is surprising is a lot of people are so focused on the problem that they're experiencing that they have trouble actually noticing when they feel stressed. And so for some people, in some circumstances, the act of fidgeting or the impulse to fidget, even if you regulate it and stop it, may be a good way, a good barometer of how you're feeling in that particular moment. Are you stressed to the point that you feel the need to physically express that stress? Or is it just something that you're doing to try and regulate how you think? Or is it something you're doing out of complete and utter boredom? But for some people in some circumstances, we use that urge to fidget as an impulse to say, okay, I am feeling some kind of stress. There may be a component to which fidgeting helps relieve that stress, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in the meantime, just being aware, I am feeling stressed. What has me feeling stressed in this moment? You can actually use it as a trigger to start taking other actions to relieve the stress that's coming up. So number one, fidgeting can be an excellent indicator of your overall stress level in any given moment. Now that's true for some people, not all, not everybody fidgets when they get stressed, but if you are a stress fidgeter, and I suspect you know who you are, and I suspect in part you know who you are because you've been criticized, censured, counseled against fidgeting, keep it in mind. Allow it to be an indicator that there's something going on. So that's number one, is using fidgeting as an indicator of stress. Number two, and this is actually kind of neat, and that's a horrible pun, is fidgeting increases non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So neat. You're basically burning calories anytime you're fidgeting. So if you're fidgeting with your hands, if you bounce your knee, if you bounce your heel, if you tap on your desk, if you tend to just kind of roll a pen in your fingers, or you roll a quarter across the back of your hand, it actually does contribute to your daily caloric use. And in part, that's just purely you have to use energy to engage in the act of fidgeting. And there's some really interesting research out there connecting fidgeting to the to balancing caloric intake. So for some people, right, it's almost impossible to eat exactly as many calories as you use during the day. What tends to happen is we'll either go under our caloric needs or will go over our caloric needs, one of the ways your body may compensate for overindulging or just taking in more than you tend to use is to up the amount you use, right? Some people fidget. Apparently, there's a biological drive behind it to burn off excess calories, literally just through motion. So there actually can be some health benefits to allowing yourself to fidget when you feel the impulse. Now, that is going to play into a much bigger picture of what your metabolism looks like, what kinds of foods are you eating, and it may not be the ultimate answer to the ultimate question of how do I maintain caloric balance. That's not what I'm trying to say, but it can play a part. And so if you're in a place where you're by yourself, or you're not going to quote unquote bother anybody by doing some fidgeting, and your body just wants to get that energy out, let it. Right? Don't hold yourself back from something that your body is driving you to do purely for other people's comfort. And this is where we're going to run into the ADHD component, because there are 3 factors in ADHD that come into play when we talk about fidgeting. So for some people, in some circumstances, fidgeting can help that person focus on the thing that isn't fidgeting. And this is really counterintuitive, right? When someone is engaging in a fidget motion, socially, that person is usually recognized as not paying attention, right? If you had ADHD, particularly inattentive ADHD, growing up, you probably got criticized quite a bit for not paying attention. Why aren't you focused on me? And the answer is really interesting in how the ADHD brain differs from the neurotypical brain. So there are 2 competing networks in the prefrontal cortex that are supposed to be active at different times. So there is what is known as the default mode network. It is basically the part of your brain that is engaged when you are doing nothing. If you are sitting in a room staring at the wall, the default mode network is what's active. There's a second set of neurons called the task-positive network. The task-positive network is involved in goal-oriented behavior. So if you are performing a task, if you're having an active conversation with somebody, if you are starting an IV, right? There's that part of your brain is going to be active in directing you towards the task at hand. What's interesting about the ADHD brain is that in the neurotypical brain, one network is active and it deactivates the other. So if you are sitting there staring at the wall, the default mode network is active and the ability of your brain to be task positive is diminished. In ADHD, both networks are typically active at the same time. One of the subjective experiences of ADHD is a lot of mental crosstalk, right? There's a lot of different things going on. Your brain is constantly seeking that extra stimulation. Part of the reason for that is that you have 2 ways of looking at the world that are both active at the same time. And where I would love to see more research into this, but what makes an intuitive connection for me is that this connects really well to the way Daniel Kahneman writes about thinking in Thinking Fast and Slow. It's some Nobel Prize winning research on human cognition, right? And he basically says you have 2 ways of thinking at any given point in time. One is instinctive, automatic, super rapid. So you can walk and not think about walking, right? That is an automatic behavior. You can then pair it with a more cognitively demanding task, right? So system 1 would be automatic, rapid, judgmental. System 1 thinking tends to be very, very judgmental. It operates based on a whole bunch of cognitive biases. System 2 thinking is much more rational. It's much slower. Cognitively, it's a lot more expensive. But it may be for ADHD people that you need some system 1 activity to quiet one of the networks in your brain in order to allow the other to focus. So fidgeting for ADHD people may actually engage a more complete process of attention when someone is struggling cognitively to follow along with whatever task that they're doing or whatever circumstance that they're in. So if you have ADHD, and you have a tendency to fidget because it helps you focus, or a tendency to doodle because it helps you focus, don't let social pressure keep you from using your brain in such a way that it serves you, right? And that's something to kind of keep in mind, is it may actually make your focus better by engaging that default mode network, by engaging that system 1 thinking and clearing the pathway for system 2 thinking to work. And that's kind of the fascinating side of the self-soothing piece of fidgeting. There is one other piece, though, and this ties back into stress and stress recovery, that I actually think we should probably be engaging in more fidgeting, not less. And so the fourth thing that really comes up around fidgeting is this concept of completing the stress cycle. So we're all pretty familiar with the origin of a stress cycle, right? We experience something that we perceive as a threat or as danger. Our body then has a physiological response, right? We get that urge to fight, fly, or flee, Sorry, fight, fly, or freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze. When you get that urge, your body is designed to pair it with physical action. So when you enter that fight category, if your instinct is to fight, well, your body gears up for taking physical action to protect yourself, to go after the task that you want. Your body wants you to move. It wants you to punch something. It wants you to throw a spear at something. It wants you to use your body in such a way that it achieves a goal. When you wind up in flight, you're using your body to achieve the goal of getting away from the thing that's chasing you, right? So flight is also engaging the physical body in that running response. When you freeze, though, there's an interesting piece of challenge there, which is that your body is getting a simultaneous signal to run like hell and also the signal to do nothing. And what we see in prey animals who have that freeze instinct, so we all know the deer in the headlights phenomenon, is the deer's instinct is to freeze. They have a very strong parasympathetic drive that forces them into that shutdown. But what we don't realize is that there is an after stage to the stress response. And so when you are having a fight, flight, freeze moment, once that freeze response wears off, prey animals will actually stand there and shake, right? If you've ever had a significant emotional event, if you've ever had your life be at risk for something, you know that there's an urge to tremble after the fact. What's happening is your body is actually physically processing that traumatic instance in such a way that you get release from the stress cycle. And this is the important part. If you do not release that physical tension with some kind of motion of your body, it may be much, much harder to process. So one thing that we know about trauma and the way people experience trauma and what tends to make an event more traumatic for an individual versus less traumatic for an individual is the feeling of helplessness. And when we are in a modern social context, like, I don't know, standing around the nurse's station and you hear somebody say something that is going after you and your reputation and your values, right? We have social restrictions on taking physical action to deal with that perceived threat, right? It's not acceptable to reach out and punch that person. It's probably a very bad thing to do, right? We're a cooperative society. But your body needs some kind of physical release after the moment of stress. And one thing we know from the literature around trauma is that if you don't have that ability to relieve stress after the fact, it may cause that trauma to become more deeply ingrained, right? It tends to make that trauma more severe for that individual. And so if you have a situation where you're chronically dealing with stress, i.e. you're a frickin' healthcare worker working in the middle of a plague, right? You're often going to be under a significant amount of stress. Fidgeting can replace that running away response. It can replace that I attacked the tiger response. It can give you that exit out of the stress cycle by just physically moving your body. And there's some really interesting research coming out around this. It's still in the nascent stages, but there seems to be a pretty strong correlation between physical motion after a difficult experience and the ability to better process that experience and let it go. So this is where you get into that interesting thing of, is it better to exercise after the fact, or is it better to fidget in the moment so that you can put that stress down and move forward? And so that's kind of the difference between what we tend to think of as stress management, right? What do I do later? What do I do 10, 12 hours from now to deal with the stress that I experienced first thing in the morning? Versus what do I do in the moment? What do I do from moment to better manage my stress level? And the really neat thing is around that topic is I'm actually putting together a stress recovery masterclass. So the goal of it is to teach you the skills of managing your stress from moment to moment, not just fidgeting. We're gonna talk about it a little bit more in depth during that training, but also how do you use your body and use your mind in such a way that you don't carry that stress from first thing in the morning all the way through to the end of the day. What can you do at the bedside to reduce your stress level? What can you do in the middle of that conversation with your boss to reduce that stress level? That masterclass is going to be not this coming Saturday, but the Saturday following. So Saturday, April 9th at 1 p.m. If you'd like more information, the link for that, and I'll put it in the comments and I'll also drop it on screen. The link for that is going to be hhb.help/RSR. And the RSR is not short for the RSR or RSR prime in certain forms of cardiac dysrhythmia. It is RSR for rapid stress recovery. Okay, so that is going to be hhb.help/RSR. Really looking forward to it and looking forward to getting to talk about this in an even more in-depth format. And yeah, go ahead and check it out, hhb.help/RSR. And I'll just drop that in the comments. And otherwise, I will see you guys very soon. Have yourself a beautiful evening.